The Doomsday machine, the Soviet secret that guarantees World War III. The silence before launch. Bolts whine, dust lifts. A single rocket claws into a black sky with no countdown, no voice, just a carrier wave thudding like a heartbeat. Below, phones die mid-sentence. Overpressure cracks windows 100 kilometers away. Radiation monitors stutter to life, then go dark. Somewhere, a clock starts measuring silence. The system isn't trying to win a war. It's answering one question when everyone who could speak is gone. Do we strike back? Who armed it? What convinces a machine that the world ended? And how do you stop something built to listen for nothing? The first fear, decapitation panic in Moscow. After October 1962, the fear stopped being abstract. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended without fire, but in Moscow it left a scar shaped like a missing head. The nightmare was simple and specific. Phones go dead, the Kremlin is gone, launch authority vaporizes over the ring roads, and a silo full of megatons waits for a voice that doesn't exist. Through the 197s, that picture narrowed from hours to minutes as accuracy improved and talk of fractional orbital bombardment and depressed trajectories seeped into briefings. Then came the hardware that turned dread into procedure. By the early 198s, Pershing II promised flight times from West Germany to Moscow about as long as a pop song. You don't govern in that window, you barely breathe. The doctrine arguments hardened along a cruel edge. Launch on warning buys speed and risks catastrophe from a false alarm. Retaliate after ride-out buys certainty and risks silence. Officers didn't debate this like academics. They practiced it like firefighters. Phones cut, switch to alternate nets, ping codes, wait, escalate. A missed check-in wasn't a clerical error, it became a fuse. Meanwhile, the early warning scaffold rose. Satellites tuned to booster heat, radars sweeping beyond the horizon, and hardened lines stitching it together. The people inside that machine traded stories about false ghosts and software that cried wolf under the wrong sun angle. Then came September 26, 1983. At Serpukhov 15, roughly 62 kilometers south of Moscow, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov watched a satellite flag incoming US launches and chose to doubt it, calling it glare. He was right. The alert was false. The incident became a parable with a bitter moral. A single sensor can scream convincingly and still be wrong. The KGB fed the Politburo with assessments that treated deception as default. Soviet collections under programs like RYAN sifted for the tiniest signs of Western preparation, reading realism as cover. Inside the general staff, planners stared at shrinking timelines and started framing a third path. Don't launch on warning. Don't trust ride-out without a backstop. Build a device that survives a first blow, and only if signatures converge and no authenticated human voice answers, transmits the order to retaliate. Not an advantage, an insurance policy against decapitation. But insurance needs rules. What counts as decapitated? Total radio silence. Cut landlines plus EMP fingerprints on cables. Overpressure waves in a predicted ring, followed by radiation upticks downwind. They defined convergence like engineers and lived with the moral twist. During a pre-authorized window in crisis, silence equals consent only when the Earth itself signs. Heat, track, shock, radiation in sequence. If a verified human voice appears with the right cipher, it overrides the machine. If no voice is left and physics sings the chorus, the order travels. Culture shifted underground. Duty rosters thickened, authentication tables rotated like clockwork, and coffee-stained checklists became talismans against panic. A young officer learned the ritual: test the nets, wait for the pings, escalate only when absence matches physics. A sergeant taped a note to a rack, never trust a single siren, and saw it turn into a line in a briefing. Micro-habits became doctrine. Then November 2/11, 1983, NATO's Able Archer threaded realism into an exercise year already scorched by Korean Airlines Flight 7 on September 1, 1983, and the Petrov false alarm on September 26, 1983. From Moscow, Able Archer looked like rehearsal disguised as practice. Fuel trucks moved, units shifted. The decapitation picture felt near. Whether perimeter was armed then is still debated, but the use case snapped into focus. If a strike can arrive under the camouflage of a drill, you need a mechanism that waits, verifies, and only moves when the world itself confirms it's burning, and still moves if you can't. April 1986 brought Chernobyl, a different disaster that nonetheless hammered the same lesson. Disjointed alarms, contradictory readings, jammed lines, technical chaos mimicked wartime fog. That drove thresholds outward. No single input could carry the day. The backstop had to reward patience by design and accept revenge as the price of restraint if restraint cost the head. The design brief coalesced inside rooms with no windows. Vimpel and allied bureaus drew up a command missile that would carry radios, not warheads, a flying launch officer. Strategic Rocket Forces automation specialists mapped authentication so that an airborne order meant nothing without the right rotating keys and unit-specific ciphers. Crypto modules were sealed behind tamper kills, pry and the codes die. The philosophy was severe and simple. Humans retain veto power as long as they can speak with verified seals. If they can't, the system carries their last authorized will across a sky full of interference. Arming it demanded politics. The Politburo would authorize a limited duty cycle in crises, a window that expired unless renewed by authenticated code. Inside that window, silence could count, but only if silence rhymed with physics. Officers trained to send holds if their local picture contradicted the machine. Holds decayed quickly, by necessity. Blast math moves faster than courage. The message beneath the forms was human. We prewrite the conditions under which we'll speak without you, and we promise not to mistake weather or fear for war. In those years, the head could be cut in minutes. The answer was to make sure the hand still moved. That's how terror becomes engineering, a machine that waits for nothing and answers only when nothing is left. The architects, men who built a machine to outlive them. They didn't think of themselves as keepers of apocalypse. They thought in tolerances and margins. Inside concrete warrens tied to the strategic rocket forces, planners from command and control directorates sat with designers from Vimpel and allied bureaus, the places where drafting tables met blast doors and crypto safes. The brief fit on one sheet and weighed a ton. Guarantee retaliation if the head is cut. Minimize human input without removing human veto. Colonel Valery Yaranish, a C2 specialist who understood wiring and nerves, kept repeating the constraint. Convergence over panic, physics over fear. They started with the chain they already had. In normal time, authority flowed through Kazbek, the nuclear briefcase system, down to launch crews. In crisis, perimeter would be armed as an alternate path, sleeping until criteria stacked. That required a doctrinal knot in an autocratic state, predelegation. The solution was legalistic. Arming is political. Logic is technical. Action is conditional. If authenticated voices can speak, they rule. If not, and only if Earth's signatures cohere, the machine transmits what leaders pre-authorized it to send. Arguments were practical, not theatrical. Automate too far and you caught a ghost launch. Automate too little and you die waiting for a phone to ring. False alarms were case studies, not rumors. Radar angels, solar glare, the September 26, 1983 Petrov episode etched into rules. One sensor is noise until others agree. An engineer showed how frontal storms could twitch barometers. Thresholds widened. A comms officer proved how troposcatter fades could mimic severed links. Timers shifted. Design became accumulated skepticism. Convergence was their religion. They mapped a sensing web where independent domains had to sing in sequence. Satellite heat, radar track, overpressure rings, radiation downwind, EMP scars on hardened lines, plus a pattern of network failures that looked like blast physics, not weather. They added meta-tests. Send heartbeat pings on rotating keys and treat silence as suspect unless physics explains it. Spoofed pings with wrong ciphers lowered confidence rather than raising it. The machine would never believe politeness. It would believe scars. Then came the voice. Vimpel sketched a command missile, a rocket with a radio warhead instead of megatons. Its job was grim and simple: rise above a continent and read out the order no one else could. The payload stacked VLF and UHF transmitters hardened against EMP, time sources disciplined by rubidium standards, and tamper-proof crypto modules seeded with one-time pads under zeroization charges. Try, and the codes died. Even success had to fail safe. Trajectory was a broadcast plan. The arc was tuned for coverage, with enough dwell to let the radio, lighthouse, sweep silos, mobile TELs, rail launchers, and deep bunkers. Receivers weren't radios, they were logs. The airborne message had to match rotating day keys, then unit keys, then target package authorizations. If a living net answered with a valid hold, local gates snapped shut. Human veto sat above everything, short-lived by necessity, because blast math eats minutes, but supreme while it lived. Testing turned into theater without applause. Command missiles flew with inert frames broadcasting structured but dead strings. Receivers logged cadence and rejected content, proof that clocks, ciphers, and antennas were aligned without opening a single lock. Synthetic EMP pulses were injected into test loops. Seismic thumpers kicked shaped waves too small to trip higher gates. Pressure rigs breathed into barometers. The algorithm did what it was built to do: correlate, raise confidence, then wait for the one thing exercises never permitted: true silence. Controllers always answered with abort inserts at the ceiling. That discipline kept drills from becoming stories with endings. April 1986 sharpened their caution. Chernobyl's chaos, disjointed alarms, jammed lines, contradictory readings, looked like war to machines. The architects hardened veto precedents. Any authenticated human voice could freeze perimeters advance, but had to refresh quickly. They codified silence equals consent only when the Earth signs. Those words slid into procedures like a splinter: necessary, uncomfortable. Maintenance realities crept into whiteboard math. Batteries age in bunkers. Connectors corrode. Oscillators drift. The designers embedded health checks that wouldn't flatter. Built-in tests under thermal stress, parity voting across paths, auto-demotion of marginal gear. Crypto custody was a ritual: two-person rules, mirrored safes, paper trails that felt medieval because they worked. A micro-story lived in margins. A senior technician tapped a panel before signing off, then jotted, "Trust clocks, not moods." That sentence survived more upgrades than he did. Secrecy carved the machine into compartments. The radar men didn't see the radio payload. The comms engineers never touched the sensing thresholds. A handful held the whole picture, and even they spoke in verbs, not nouns. Converge, authenticate, veto, transmit. Western intelligence later sketched pieces, odd radio arcs, telemetry without warheads, defector whispers about an alternative command path, and stapled on a name: perimeter. Inside, the architects called it work. Ethics were handled like explosives, carefully and away from heat. Critics inside the circle said the quiet part: a device built to guarantee retaliation also preserves the chance of error. Advocates answered with math. Pershing timelines shrink choice to seconds. Hypersonic torque threatens to shave that further. Predelegation is the only way to keep ride-out credible without hair-trigger launch-on warning. Nobody cheered. They wrote thresholds and stacked vetoes. They designed for failure that wouldn't stop the message. Multiple command missiles in separated silos, overlapping arcs, frequency agility keyed to time. If one rocket died, another would speak. If one band was jammed, another would whisper. Fail deadly wasn't the point. Fail persistent was. Keep broadcasting until every receiver has either heard and acted or vetoed because a living voice still exists. By the early 198s, the blueprint felt like a confession written in circuits. Humans would decide as long as they could. If they couldn't, the machine would finish a sentence leaders had written in peacetime. If the head is cut and the Earth confirms it, the hand moves. The architects weren't proud of that. They were precise. The sensing web, how perimeter knows the unthinkable happened. To judge the end of the world, they gave the machine more than eyes. They gave it a chorus. Overhead, satellites looked for the hot stab of boosters, sharp, rising signatures, not the ragged smear of forest fires. On the horizon, radars hurled waves that curved past line of sight. catching arcs as they crested. Underground, seismic posts waited for a kind of thunder that doesn't rumble so much as slap the crust. Barometers watched for overpressure rings arriving in the order blast physics predicts. Radiation monitors sniffed for the metal taste of ionization that weather can't carry. EMP detectors rode the cables, mapping the telltale surge that rips through shielding in patterns storms don't leave. But that was only half the web. The other half listened for people. The strategic rocket forces pulsed heartbeat pings along landlines, fiber, troposcatter and coded radio nets, timed, authenticated rotating keys. Civil defense telemetry was folded in, power draw at exchanges, trunk switch activity, the hum of ordinary life. The logic was brutal and patient. If the nets are alive and voices answer with the right seals, humans decide. If the nets go dark in a way that matches blast physics, and only then, the machine moves from listening to preparing to speak. Convergence was the rule that kept fear from becoming launch. One sensor is an opinion, 3 independent ones arriving in the right sequence are a verdict. A satellite flags heat from a known field. Good start. A radar tracks objects with velocities that fit the math. Better. Minutes later, an overpressure ring slaps a barometer in the correct sector, and radiation ticks rise downwind. Confidence climbs. Meanwhile, heartbeat pings elate across multiple hardened paths. The system doesn't leap, it waits for scars to rhyme. The web carried skepticism about itself. After September 26, 1983, when a glare geometry at Serpukhov 15 tricked a satellite into shouting, "Launch," and Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov refused to believe it, software filters were rewritten. Single-sensor heat spikes at certain sun angles were discounted unless ground signatures appeared on time. Solar storms were modeled to avoid mistaking ionospheric wobbles for EMP fingerprints. Global seismology feeds taught the machine the difference between tectonic waves and blast shock. A young engineer wrote it on a whiteboard and then into code. Don't treat first noise as chorus. Spoofing and cyber mischief were treated as living threats. A clean ping with the wrong rotating key lowered confidence. Politeness without the right cipher was worse than silence. Test frames were injected at known windows to prove receivers were awake. Anything outside those windows raised suspicion, not assurance. Time sources were cross-checked. Rubidium disciplined, terrestrial longwave references, internal clocks voting, to keep a corrupted clock from sliding frames past receivers. Physics, not software, held the gavel. Timing gates were set to human realities and blast math. If launches lifted from a field, the machine knew when the pressure wave should hit certain rings. Too early, confidence drops. Too late, same. If EMP scars bloomed on hardened lines without accompanying overpressure in the predicted window, the system treated it as a trick until the Earth confirmed otherwise. It could accelerate checks, but not pass the speed of scars. Patience enforced. Meanwhile, the machine kept talking to the living. Short authenticated bursts pinged priority nets while satellites and radars whispered. Any verified human hold could freeze the advance locally, then globally if it propagated through still living nodes. Holds expired quickly by design. A voice can't be treated as alive forever when minutes are knives. A valid refresh renewed veto. The ethics stayed consistent. The living rule until they can't prove they're living. Edge cases were thought through at 3 a.m. Could a big quake spoof half the net? Maybe, but not the sequence or the spectrum. Tectonic waves don't pair with prompt radiation upticks. Could an adversary jam UHF, flood VLF and fake pings? They could try. Receivers voted across bands and paths, reassembled frames from fragments, and punished coincidences that smelled like code, not catastrophe. Could cyber delay a hold? Yes. That's why silence never counted alone. Only silence that matched scars. Every 30 seconds, the web asked for a new reason to wait. Sometimes the answer was simple. A late ping arrives with the right cipher, and the internal clock resets. Sometimes it was hard. A barometric bump appears during a storm, but its profile is wrong and no second station agrees. Demoted. The operator notes it and drinks his tea. Convergence protects you from weather and from yourself. Inside this lattice, authentication sat like steel. Keys rotated on schedules that didn't care about snow or fuel. Units carried day tables and unit ciphers. The web's own pings were locked under the same discipline. A valid anomaly without valid seals was treated as a hostile imitation. A valid seal without physics was treated as a mistake. Only when both arrived, scars and silence aligned, did the internal gate slide toward the command missile. In the end, the sensing web wasn't built to be clever. It was built to be stubborn. It refused to move on drama. It demanded heat, track, shock, and radiation in that order, plus a pattern of dead lines that looked like they'd been cut by light, not laziness. And if, through that window, a real human voice spoke with the right keys, the machine stood down. If not, it handed the verdict upward to a rocket that carried no warhead and all the authority left. The command missile, a flying launch officer. It carries no megatons, just authority. Crews called it a flying launch officer because that's what it did. Climb above a continent and read out the order no one else could. Vimpel's engineers built it like a broadcast tower wrapped in a missile body, a radio warhead stacked with VLF and UHF transmitters, shielded power rails, disciplined time sources, and tamper-proof crypto that would die before it talked to the wrong hands. The idea wasn't elegant, it was dependable. Ground networks can burn, cables can fry, an airborne voice sees over mountains and ash. Trajectory was the first piece of choreography. The arc had to give line of sight to the heartland, skim long enough to sweep the grid, then linger where valleys and forests hide mast tips. Engineers tuned the profile to layer signals, crisp UHF bursts for units in clean sight, long VLF waves that bend and crawl, sliding into steel and earth where nothing else reaches. The missile didn't sprint. It paced stage by stage, so every receiver got at least 2 passes to hear, verify, and unlock. Down below, nothing opened on faith. Receivers weren't radios, they were locks with 3 tumblers. First, day keys, rotating ciphers preloaded under 2-person custody. Then unit keys, unique cuts that prove the message knows who it's talking to. Finally, package authorization, target tables tied to the day's posture. Only when all 3 aligned did the permissive link step aside and let a countdown begin. A valid message with a stale day key died at the door. A perfect cipher without the right unit cut rang like a stranger's knock. Even a correct frame couldn't force a stale package. The logic refused to improvise targets in chaos. Meanwhile, human veto sat above the whole ritual like a hand on the brake. If a living net could speak with the right seals, a hold froze the cascade locally and, if propagated, regionally. Holds weren't speeches. They were tight code groups that decayed on short timers. A hold had to refresh through a living channel. If it didn't, the gate fell back to the machine's inference. Scars plus silence. You can feel the ethic. Keep the human voice sovereign while it's provably alive, then let physics carry the rest. Inside the missile's nose, the radio brain moved in a cadence duty officers knew by muscle. Activation. Identify. Authenticate. Execute. Frames repeated across both bands with interleaved parity, time stamped against rubidium-disciplined clocks cross-checked by long-wave references. Jammers could smear a single burst, but the next came on a shifted slot, and receivers voted across fragments to reconstruct the frame. If UHF died in clutter, VLF seeped through and finished the sentence. Security sat under glass with teeth. Crypto modules carried one-time pads sealed with zeroization charges. Pry and the guts turned to ash. The transmitter wouldn't speak until it passed its own integrity checks against ground-seeded hashes. A mismatch meant silence. That wasn't just counterintelligence. It protected against half-failures. The worst case, where a garble could split a force into launching and not launching. Designers like Colonel Valery Yaranish pushed redundancy until circuitry mirrored psychology. Either everyone hears the same clear order or nobody moves. Coverage wasn't a single arc. Reports point to multiple command missiles in separated silos with overlapping skies. If sabotage killed one, another would rise. If an adversary smothered a band, the companion would whisper on a different one. Mobile TELs trained to pop into clearings as the window approached. Rail launchers timed their moves to predictable passes. Submarines listened for VLF that travels like a slow drumbeat through seawater. The flying officer wasn't picky about platforms. If you were part of the force and still breathing, it expected you to hear. A micro-story lived in a drill no one advertised. A command missile with inert content climbed and began its sweep. In a ravine, a receiver sat under noise, pulling shards of UHF while the VLF lagged. The frame came in tatters, then reassembled on the second pass. The unit logged reception and rejection, structure valid, payload inert, proof the lock would open if it had to. Back at the bunker, a comms officer drew a circle around the fade and muttered to a technician, "Turn the mast 2 fingers next time." That note made it into the next field order. The message wasn't an electronic shout. It felt human in its rhythm because humans chose the rhythm. Duty officers who lived on encrypted nets tuned the cadence so crews could ride the beats under stress. Hear, verify, unlock, confirm. Even in the worst scenario, no voices, no phones, the procedures didn't turn men into bystanders. Hands still moved through checklists, readbacks still ran, and a local commander could yank a hold if his surviving sensors contradicted the sky. Here's the paradox they accepted. The command missile didn't start a war. It completed a decision already written. During an armed window, if the Earth proves attack and no authenticated voice survives, the order to retaliate travels. That's harsh. It's also restraint by another name. The airborne voice punishes haste by demanding scars, and it punishes decapitation by remaining audible when everything else is flame. In a world that squeezes minutes into seconds, that's what deterrence sounds like. A knock from the sky, asking your locks to listen. The switch, arming, delegation, and the line you don't cross. The machine doesn't wake itself. Someone has to turn the key that lets it listen for silence. That key lived at the top, Politburo authority flowing through the general staff. Because arming perimeter wasn't posture, it was crisis. The order came in plain phrases. Authorize an armed window, define its length, bind it to renewal codes, and treat silence as meaningful only when physics agrees. Heat, track, shock, radiation, in sequence. The point wasn't to make a robot brave. It was to make fear walk on rails. Delegation was layered like armor. In peacetime, Kazbek and living leadership ruled. In crisis, the general staff could authorize strategic rocket forces to arm perimeter, prepare, monitor, run timers, but not to act. Action lived behind gates, converging scars and the absence of an authenticated veto. That separation mattered. Arming was a leash, not a release, and the leash had a clock. When the duty cycle ended, a renewal cipher had to arrive through a verified channel. If it didn't, the system stepped down, not forward. Inside that window, silence got teeth. Timed pings went out across diverse paths. Landline, fiber, troposcatter, VLF, with rotating keys. Miss one check-in and nothing happens. Miss several across hardened paths while the sensing web sees scars lining up and the machine advances to the next gate. It doesn't sprint. It moves like a court. Present evidence, cross-check, then pause for any living voice to object. A valid hold, tight code group, fresh key, slams the gate shut locally and can propagate. Holds expire fast by design. Blast math kills long permissions. Arming felt like weather in the bunkers. The air changed. Checklists got a new column. Two-person rules tightened to ritual. Codes were read back with a firmness that sounded like prayer without the words. A captain would brief the room. Window start, window end, renewal time, escalation gates, hold formats. Then he'd tap the clock and tell a sergeant, no freelancing. The sergeant would nod and add a quiet joke to bleed tension. Everyone understood the sentence behind the forms. We're preloading a decision we hope we never need. A micro-story from a winter exercise shows the edge. Snow iced microwave links and pushed a regional net late. The timer slid toward its mark. A duty officer watched his display, keyed a backup net, got static, then reached for the abort insert, a manual cease that halts the drill's climb. 20 seconds later, a drenched tech at a relay hut yelled the cipher into a handset with breath that sounded like smoke. The room stood down, logged the near miss, and wrote a note in the margin. Never let weather own the clock. Cross-domain quorum guarded against local blindness. Alternate command posts could arm or stand down within their lane if the primary went dark. but only with corroborating codes from an independent node. 2 dead phones couldn't trick perimeter into hearing a choir. Communications officers called it sanity. Engineers called it fault tolerance. Either way, it kept a cratered switchyard from masquerading as decapitation. Arming was also messaging, inside and out. Internally, it told crews, treat silence carefully, treat physics like a judge. Externally, if the hint leaked, through analysis or rumor, it told adversaries, even if you aim for the throat, the hand will still move. Strategic ambiguity did work here. No speeches, just the steady implication that a backstop could rise when time collapsed. The line they wouldn't cross was casual arming. It wasn't a status you toggled because tempers ran hot. It came with dual custody, mirrored safes, and paper trails that felt theatrical until you needed them. 2 officers, separate codes, audible readbacks, deliberate pacing. Slowness wasn't kindness. It was safety. A machine built to speak for the dead shouldn't be woken by a shrug. Cyber made the switch harder and more necessary. A jammed net can look like silence. A delayed hold can look like consent. That's why silence by itself counted for nothing. It had to rhyme with scars, EMP fingerprints, overpressure rings arriving on time, radiation downwind. The doctrine didn't change, it got stricter. Physics had to sign the note. Holds and vetoes lived with the same discipline. A local commander, alive and connected, could freeze the cascade if his picture contradicted the machine's inference. But the hold decayed quickly and demanded refresh. That wasn't cruelty, it matched the threat. If a hypersonic strike can stun the head and peel the phone out of your hand in minutes, a veto that lasts hours isn't realism, it's superstition. Crews internalized all of it as muscle. A lieutenant could recite window parameters in his sleep. A senior sergeant kept a penciled grid on a clipboard, checks, pings, holds, renewals, and crossed lines with a neatness that looked like calm. When arming ended cleanly, the room exhaled and turned back into a bunker with humming lights. When it didn't, when timers slid and nets stuttered, the ritual held the hands until proof arrived or the sky had to speak. Here's the paradox made practical. By predelegating a narrow, brutal choice, leaders made restraints survivable. Arming perimeter didn't make war more likely. It allowed them not to launch on a screen. It punished deception by refusing to move without scars. It punished decapitation by guaranteeing a voice after the cut. The line they didn't cross was trusting feelings when the clock got loud. They trusted thresholds, timers, and a sentence engraved in procedures. Silence equals consent only when the earth itself signs. The crisis beat. Able Archer 83 and the edge of miscalculation. November 2/11, 1983. NATO ran Able Archer, a command post exercise that flipped through the steps of nuclear release with unusual polish. New message formats, tighter radio discipline, senior participation that felt uncomfortably real. On NATO's side, it read like rehearsal. In Moscow, it read like camouflage. The year was already raw. Korean Airlines Flight 7 burned into memory on September 1, and on September 26 at Serpukhov 15, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov had stared down a screaming satellite and said no. Now the West was practicing, and the patterns, if you were primed to see deception, lined up. Soviet residentiaries fed back fragments that confirmed fear instead of testing it. Fuel convoys, aircraft dispersals, the sudden hush after procedural injects. To KGB analysts swimming in Operation RYAN's mandate, Able Archer looked like a mask-Maskirovka template. Simulate the paperwork, build muscle memory, then pivot to a headshot under cover of realism. Inside the general staff, the timeline questions snapped shut again. Minutes to interpret, not hours to debate. Launch on warning risked a Petrov in reverse. Ride out risked silence. The third path, arm the backstop, demand convergence, and speak only if the world burned and the phones died, sounded less like theory and more like a seatbelt you buckle before the curve. Units tightened posture. Strategic rocket forces ticked alert states upward. Air defense radars leaned forward. Nuclear storage saw movement that Western collectors later read as rehearsed dispersal. From the ground, it felt like a throat clearing before a scream. One junior operator at a communications hub watched a timer roll and blurted, Say when we're safe." His colonel answered without turning, "When we're not talking, worry." It wasn't bravado. It was a grim heuristic. The shape of a real strike would silence you first. Meanwhile, across the line, NATO officers assumed the choreography read as theater. It didn't. The Stasi and other Warsaw Pact services pulled audio and logs that exaggerated the sense of imminence. Western intelligence noticed Soviet jitters, but underestimated the slope of their fear. Here's the irony. Realism, added to make the exercise meaningful, made it indistinguishable from the first pages of a first strike to the people most afraid of decapitation. Inside Moscow's sealed rooms, perimeter's advocates pointed to a whiteboard with two columns. Column 1, launch on warning, fast, fragile, haunted by false alarms and glare. Column 2, ride out with nothing, slow, brave, vulnerable to headshots. The line beneath both said what nobody wanted to say aloud. You will hesitate when it matters. A backstop constrained that hesitation. Armed by political order, bounded by time, deaf to theater, it would force patience before revenge and guarantee revenge if patience cost the head. Able Archer didn't flip the switch. It made the case. Tactical signals multiplied the nerves. After key injects, NATO nets went deliberately quiet as part of scripted EMCON. To Soviet ears, the hush sounded like the silence before a real launch. The KGB's indicators of preparatory measures lit like a Christmas tree. Leave cancellations, command bunkers bustling, unusual message formats. Add the fresh memory of KAL-7, a civilian airliner shot down in a fog of misreading, and the Petrov scare. One man saving the world by refusing to trust a single sensor, and you had institutions primed to overweigh shadows. What nobody knew in the moment was how close their interpretations might drift toward the cliff. Later reports suggest back-channel reassurances and analytic restraint on both sides eased posture before the end of the exercise. The week closed on November 11 without incident, but the debrief in Moscow didn't feel like relief. It felt like a verdict. The files read blunt. Western realism can be misread as attack prep. Our indicators can confirm our own fear. Compressed time makes humans dangerous to themselves. Build a device that won't believe theater, won't launch on a scream, and still speaks if the head is gone. A micro-story from those days stuck in a notebook. A duty officer logged a pattern of high-frequency bursts that matched a known exercise format. His partner underlined the timestamp and wrote, "If this were real, the phones would be ash." That line turned into a slide, then into doctrine. Treat silence as suspicious only when physics explains it. It's the same ethos Petrov followed. Hold fire until the chorus sings. And the same rule perimeter encoded. Heat, track, shock, radiation, in sequence, plus dead lines that look like light did the cutting. Able Archer became a hinge for more than memory. It fed budgets, hardened thresholds, and years later, colored the January 25, 1995 Norwegian scientific rocket scare, when raw signatures briefly spiked concern until context caught up. The lesson traveled. Realism is useful until it isn't. Ambiguity deters until it blinds. Automation is reckless until it forces patience. The backstop lived in that narrow truth. It turned a terrifying week into a requirement. If your enemy's drill can look like your death, you need a machine that waits for scars and still answers when you can't. Shadow and signal, secrecy, disinformation, and Western guesswork. Building it was only half the job. Hiding it was the art. Inside the Soviet machine, perimeter sat behind code names and partitions so clean that engineers soldering radio boards never saw sensing thresholds, and officers writing arming procedures never touched the missile. Compartmentalization wasn't just tradecraft, it was insurance. If you didn't know the whole animal, you couldn't betray it, even by accident. Budgets spoke in euphemism. Communications resilience paid for hardened VLF arrays. Seismic telemetry integration bought thumpers and filters. Audit trails wore enough stamps to freeze questions. Paperwork was a moat around a secret that didn't want attention. The strategic rocket forces treated perimeter like a shadow Kazbek, implied in every serious briefing, named in none. From the western side, scraps made a mosaic nobody agreed on. Signal posts on the Barents, and in Germany logged odd arcs. Launches with no thermonuclear signature, just disciplined VLF and UHF bursts stepping across the sky. The frames looked like commands without content. Analysts wrote consistent with an emergency broadcast system and fought over the footnotes. Was it a live backstop, or just a Soviet echo of America's ERCS, Emergency Rocket Communication System, reimagined and never trusted? Defectors and immigrés added color, not clarity. One engineer described an alternative command path that would speak from above if ground nets died. Another muttered about Tampa-kill crypto modules, pry, and the codes turned to dust. Names floated. Vimpel on the payload, allied bureaus on the booster, special directorates on the ciphers. Colonel Valery Yarinish, years later, would sketch the logic and the caution in public. Convergence over panic, automation bounded by veto, a command missile as courier, not trigger. Western ears perked up because his words aligned with earlier noise. Meanwhile, the Stasi and other Warsaw Pact services did their own fishing. Intercepts and logs bled west, salted with theater and truth. A radio exercise here, an anomalous arc there, enough to suggest a spine under the rumor, but secrecy did most of the work. Strategic ambiguity was a weapon. Hint that a headshot won't be clean, and your adversary plans as if it won't be clean. Inside NATO rooms, briefers learned to let silence do the talking. A colonel would click to a slide labeled Alternate Command Broadcasting, show a map with shaded swathes over the Soviet heartland, then stop. He didn't over-explain. The absence was the message. If you can't guarantee a decapitation, you live on deterrence, not on fantasies of a surgical first strike. Technical collectors chased physics. If the Soviets had a command missile, its radio profile would be distinct. VLF that crawled like a slow wave, UHF that snapped in time-stamped bursts, a cadence that repeated with enough redundancy to beat jamming. A handful of arcs fit. Training, dummy payload. The argument always landed on careful verbs. Likely, plausible, consistent with never proven. In intelligence, ambiguity is both shield and fog. Soviet disinformation shops didn't need to gild this one. A rumor in a defense journal about assured post-attack command. A retired general at a conference saying guaranteed retaliation mechanisms. No diagrams, just enough meat to keep planners wary. When asked directly, officials used phrases like reliable control and resilient communication and changed the subject. The best lies borrow from truth. Here, the truth, hidden, did the job. Secrecy had a cost inside, too. A system you can't parade can't be tested end-to-end in daylight. The Soviets ran hollow-tooth flights, injected synthetic scars, rehearsed aborts, but the full chain never closed outside the worst case. That fragility kept sober officers awake. Deterrence rests on belief. Belief rests on credibility. Credibility rests on a machine that must work the first time it truly matters. You shore up belief with layers. Redundant missiles, multiple bans, Tampa-kill crypto, and with culture, checklists, two-person rules, paranoid maintenance. You let fear do the rest. Western skepticism had its own danger. If you shrug and call perimeter a bluff, you might plan as if a beheading is clean. If you overrate it, you might treat every silence in a crisis like a tripwire. Ambiguity deters and blinds in equal measure. The safe lane is narrow. Assume the backstop exists and works well enough, and build policy around patience, not speed. Share early warning data where you can. Keep hotlines warm. Don't choreograph exercises so real they rhyme with a first strike. Inside Russia after 1991, the curtain stayed down, but the hints kept pace with modernization. References to upgraded over-the-horizon radars, new early warning satellites, improved post-attack command resilience. A senior officer once said, "As long as the state exists, control exists, not proof positioning." The message to any planner calculating a headshot was boring and terrifying. Even if you blind us, something else is listening. That's the shadow game perimeter was built to play. A secret that works best when it's never used. A rumor that shapes doctrine. A machine that hides behind ordinary words. Resilience, redundancy, reliability, and waits for a day everyone hopes never arrives. Meanwhile, analysts on both sides keep arguing over the mosaic, because arguing is safer than finding out the answer the hard way. Trials without apocalypse, testing a doomsday system. You can't close the loop without risking the worst headline ever written, so they learn to test in pieces, everything but the last inch. Radios were punished in shielded cages. Seismometers were set beside controlled charges that kicked a shaped wave, small enough to be safe, sharp enough to teach. Barometers breathed manufactured overpressure. EMP simulators cracked a whip through cables to see if the surge read like war or like a lab trick. Each drill climbed toward a ceiling where a single code group, the abort insert, froze the process on command. Confidence without closure, that was the art. Command missiles flew with hollow teeth. On range days, a booster rose clean and the radio, warhead, spoke in structure only. Activation frames, authentication scaffolding, parity rhythm, everything except live content. Receivers across the heartland logged cadence and rejected substance. That rejection was the pass. It proved clocks were in step, ciphers rotated on time, antennas were tuned, and units could hear the knock without opening the lock. No unit launched, every unit learned. They rehearsed convergence with synthetic scars. Controllers injected a false satellite, hot, at an angle known to glare, then refused ground confirmations. The system demoted it, as rewritten after September 26, 1983. Next, a radar track appeared without the overpressure ring that blast math demands. Confidence dipped by design. Later, a paired hit. A shaped thump on a seismic post plus a tight overpressure bump at a barometer 2 districts over. Good. The algorithm raised an eyebrow, then asked for radiation downwind. No radiation, no advance. Patience, enforced in code. VLF and UHF were tested like a duet. Jamming teams tried to smear the UHF bursts and drown the VLF with noise. Receivers fought back with frequency agility keyed to disciplined time, interleaving parity so a single bad frame couldn't wreck the message. A jammer officer once bragged he'd punched noise at the exact millisecond of an expected burst. The next pass shifted, the receivers reassembled the frame from shards, and the officer sent a bottle to the comms lab with a note. "I'll bring 2 next time." They kept the note, then added another layer of time hopping. Mobile units learned the geometry of hearing. TEL crews took their vehicles into forests where wet leaves swallowed UHF. The lesson turned into ritual. When the window approaches, find your clearing, raise the mast, verify the table, listen twice. One lieutenant picked the wrong clearing by 50 meters, missed the first pass, caught the second, and wrote 4 words on his clipboard. Distance is doctrine. It became a unit mantra. Timing was a teacher and a bully. Everything hinged on clocks, cipher rotation, burst sequencing, hold decay, renewal gates. Rubidium standards anchored the bunker. Long-wave broadcasts backed the rubidium. Internal oscillators voted in triplicate, so one drifting crystal couldn't slide frames out of the slot. Drills included dirty time. Controllers introduced a small skew to see if receivers would refuse out-of-window bursts. When one rack accepted a frame 2 seconds late, the debrief lasted until dawn. The rack got tuned, the checklist got a new line. Trust clocks, not moods. Aborts were their own ritual. In complex exercises, controllers drove the sequence up the ladder, converging signatures, late pings, rising confidence, and then through a manual cease. 2 officers, 2 safes, 2 halves of a word. Readbacks loud enough to cut through nerves. The room learned the feel of escalation and the sound of the break. Escalation was quiet. The break was not. You wanted both to feel familiar. Crypto custody ran like liturgy. Couriers swapped day tables under dual control. Tamper seals were inspected with the same attention you give a child's breathing. Techs practiced zeroing a module on a buzzer, lift the lid, boom, dead codes, dead radio, until a new brain slid in. Red teams tried to slip lookalike frames. Receivers spat them out. "Wrong mouth," one operator joked, then marked the log with neat block letters that would be audited 3 times before sunrise. EdgeCase Labs found gremlins before gremlins found them. A ravine trial put a receiver in shadow, layered with electronic clutter. The command missile surrogate trudged through its arc. First pass, UHF in tatters, VLF Aruma. Second pass, enough parity to reconstruct the frame. The unit logged, structure valid, payload inert, then circled a fade on the map. Antenna orientation changed in the next field order. A small tilt became policy. Chernobyl's lesson hovered over every rehearsal. Disjointed alarms and jammed lines can look like war to a machine, so drills taught the veto rhythm. Any authenticated hold froze a local cascade, then rippled, short-lived by necessity, demanding refresh. Operators practiced calling holds without flinching and practiced letting them decay when the picture didn't justify survival. The ethic was plain. The human voice is king until it can't prove it's alive, and physics is king after that. Every test ended in paper. Logs cross-checked against telemetry, custody sheets against ink colors, signatures against times that matched the master clock. If the ink changed mid-drill, a captain re-verified the table. Superstition polished into discipline. Coffee rings on checklists became unofficial timestamps. Fresh ring, fresh eyes. The culture kept the machine honest because the machine's first true day would offer no rehearsal. They never closed the loop. They didn't need to. Layer by layer, they proved that pieces lock, vetoes bite, jammers struggle, clocks hold, and the airborne knock can be heard without being obeyed until it must be. Trials without apocalypse taught the room to trust scars over screams, and to stop just shy of the point where trust turns into fire. The weak link, bureaucracy, maintenance, and the clock. Machines don't fail in theory. They fail in rooms that smell like dust and hot plastic. Perimeters promise, speak when no one else can, depends on parts that age in silence. Capacitors dry in sealed cans. Connectors bloom verdigris in racks no one opens until an audit. A VLF coupler that looked fine last quarter loses a sliver of gain and steals the last decibels a buried receiver counts on. Readiness is a number on a form. Numbers don't carry signals across a dying joint. Bureaucracy shows up first as delay. To touch a crypto module, you need 2 officers, 2 safes, mirrored logs, and a courier with the right stamp. That's how you keep thieves and shortcuts out. It's also how an amber light blinks for hours while a signature crawls across town. A transmitter scheduled for overhaul at 2,000 hours runs to 2,650 because the replacement is in transit. The report stays green because the built-in test passes at room temperature. War isn't room temperature. Budgets bend the timetable. After 1991, depots closed, factories changed names and spare lines thinned. Senior warrant officers, the ones who could tune a stubborn preselector by ear, retired. Their notes lived on tape over panels. Tap here, contact weak. The tape dried and fell. The trick went with it. A junior tech follows the checklist, does everything right, and still leaves a DB on the table because the checklist can't teach a hand's memory. Clocks are the quiet terror. Everything in perimeter rides time. Cipher rotation, burst phasing, hold decay, renewal gates. Rubidium helps, but crystals drift. Drift hides in good weather and shows up when you can least afford it. A receiver's gate window slides by a second, then 2. In drills, controllers skew a node and watch the web demote its vote. In life, nobody announces the skew. A frame arrives perfect and lands in the crack between ticks. The lock hears a stranger. Cyber turns delay into suspicion. A man in the middle can nudge a heartbeat outside jitter budgets without tripping alarms. A worm can desynchronize a secondary clock by fractions that don't light a panel but bend a window enough to miss a pass. The doctrine holds, silence alone means nothing, but operators feel the difference between a dead line and a numb one. The fix isn't bravado, it's cross-check. Long-wave time, internal ensembles, disciplined rubidium, and a habit of distrusting a single clock, no matter how expensive it is. Crypto custody keeps Deterrence honest and crews exhausted. Day tables rotate on schedules that ignore snow. Couriers miss a bridge. A unit falls back to contingency keys, valid older, easy to forget in the margin. Reconciliation steals a shift. Meanwhile, the room is tempted to say good enough. Good enough is a rumor that travels fast. The only antidote is liturgy. Readbacks out loud, seals inspected like lungs, zeros drills that kill clean when a lid lifts wrong. Jammers don't have to be clever if entropy helps them. A hairline crack in a mast joint, a ground strap corroded to threads, a leaf-soaked canopy that swallows UHF, an unseated connector that rides fine until vibration makes it a coin toss. Under load, margin is everything. The airborne cadence hits like a metronome. A tired coupler turns rhythm into fuzz. The receiver votes across fragments, reconstructs a frame on the second pass, and barely makes it. Barely is not a plan. Culture fights entropy with boredom. Two-person rules slow hands without slowing windows. Checklists force humility. A lieutenant reads a hold phrase every shift, the same syllables, until he could say it in smoke. A sergeant keeps a penciled grid of pings, renewals, and timers, lines so neat you could measure them. A young tech calls a retired chief at home and counts beats against a long-wave beacon to drag a wandering oscillator back into budget. The log says routine adjustment. Everyone knows it was. Metrics cut both ways. Headquarters loves green bars. Green bars come from self-tests. Self-tests pass at 22 degrees in calm air. A rack that sings in a lab wheezes under thermal shock when the command missile lights. Fixing that takes a bench, a part out of a warehouse that might now be a shopping mall, and a colonel willing to sign a form that makes his numbers worse before they get better. That's leadership in a system where honesty can look like failure. A micro-story says more than a chart. Night shift, winter, the generator hiccups and catches. A VLF preselector hums wrong, a note you feel in bone, not ear. The tech doesn't trust his mood. He pulls the book, runs the sweep, logs the slope, and phones the standby. By dawn, the rack is tuned, the hum is right, and the only mark is a coffee ring on a checklist. Deterrence survives on coffee rings no one sees. Silence equals consent only when physics testifies. That line assumes the machine can hear the chorus. Hearing depends on parts, clocks, and people who refuse to round corners. The enemy plans to blind you. Entropy will do it for free if you let it. The only counter is unglamorous. Calibrate on time, cannibalize when you must, tell the truth in ink, and train the habit that keeps a single second from becoming a hole big enough to lose a skyborne sentence. Collapse and continuity. Perimeter after the Soviet Union. December 1991 felt like a power outage that started at the top. Flags came down, names changed, and phones rang to offices that no longer existed. The silos didn't care. A command missile can't read a constitution. Inside bunkers, officers stared at binders stamped USSR and waited for a voice from a capital still choosing its letterhead. Pace slipped. Fuel chits bounced. Couriers carrying crypto packages reached new borders and turned back with neat apology stamps. Continuity became a human decision. A lieutenant colonel at a command node called 3 ministries to ask where to ship expired day tables. One said burn. One said hold. One said wait. He rolled a cot beside the safe and chose to hold. He wasn't making policy. He was refusing to be the person who guessed wrong. For weeks, renewal keys arrived late, sometimes by hand, sometimes on fallback circuits that smelled like the 197s. The room learned to keep windows short and pencils sharp. Ownership wasn't a memo. It was geography. Warheads and launchers sat in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Treaties and trains had to move steel east without letting control evaporate in transit. Until the transfers settled, the command web looked like a house with missing walls. Units drilled, paper only, because diesel was rationed. Time servers drifted. Techs pulled long-wave references out of the air and nudged oscillators back into budget with kitchen metronomes and stubborn patience. Logs called it routine adjustment. Everyone knew routine had nothing to do with it. Secrecy didn't soften. The new state inherited the same silence. Perimeter was never named, only implied in phrases like assured retaliation and reliable command and control. Behind those words, engineers opened quiet cabinets. Some command missiles were past overhaul. VLF couplers needed new finals. Receivers ran on clocks that had missed a calibration cycle too many. Early warning inputs were changing. Aging OCO satellites, radars taken down, others spun up. The question wasn't whether the backstop existed. It was whether it could still speak in the only minute that mattered. Budgets turned precision into triage. Depots closed. Vendors renamed themselves, then disappeared. Senior warrant officers retired with the tacit knowledge that let them hear a drifting preselector by bone. A young tech stood at a rack with a perfect checklist and no feel for the wrong hum. Culture tried to bridge the gap. Two-person rules stayed sacred. Crypto custody didn't flinch. Dual control, mirrored safes, tamper seals inspected like breath. When a tamper module failed a test, they killed it and wrote a new brain in, zeros in clean. The ritual survived the flag. Ambiguity carried outward by design. Western analysts asked if the backstop had been mothballed. Russian officers hinted at continuity without committing. The silhouette stayed intact. Command missiles as couriers. Convergence before action. Human veto above the machine, as long as any authenticated voice could speak. Strategic ambiguity is a deterrent when it sounds plausible. If adversaries smelled decay, decapitation math might look clean again. So the hints kept pace with restraint. No diagrams, just enough to keep planners wary. Then came January 25, 1995. A Norwegian scientific rocket climbed into a black sky with a profile that rhymed badly with a threat, and Russian early warning channels lit. Context caught up in minutes, but those minutes were a stress test. The debrief sounded like an echo from 1983. Raw signatures are loud. Procedures must be louder. Cross-domain verification hardened. Out-of-band advisories were drilled. Renewal ciphers and hold phrases were practiced until the room could speak them underwater. Modernization crept back in as the 200 steadied. New early warning satellites replaced the blind spots. Over-the-horizon radars returned with cleaner sweeps. VLF arrays got fresher grounds. UHF payloads traded old silicon for tighter clocks and better error correction. Command missiles rode more reliable boosters. Receivers voted across more channels. The ethic never changed. Convergence over panic. Physics over rumor. Silence equals consent only when the Earth signs, and any authenticated veto still wins if it can reach the wire in time. Inside, the work stayed unglamorous. A captain traced a readiness number back to a self-test that passed at room temperature and wrote a blistering margin note. War isn't 22 degrees. A warrant officer drove a mislabeled crate of oscillators across town because the new database couldn't spell the old part. A junior operator called a retired chief at home to count beats against a long-wave station and haul a wandering oscillator into jitter budget. Coffee stained the checklist. Deterrence lived in the stain. Strategically, the logic held tighter as flight times shrank and cyber fog thickened. Hypersonic torque made windows thinner. Interference got smarter. If leadership can be numbed instead of cut, the effect is the same. A backstop that refuses to launch on a scream and still guarantees a reply after a blow becomes policy insurance again. You don't advertise it, you keep it credible. You drill young hands until the hold phrase is a reflex, and the cadence of the airborne knock feels like an old friend you hope to never meet. Continuity was never a speech. It was a series of small decisions made by tired people under bad lights. Keep the window short, refresh on time, distrust single sirens, calibrate clocks, write the log honest. The flag changed. The physics didn't. The doctrine didn't. If the head is cut and the earth proves it, the hand moves. If a living voice can speak, it rules. And somewhere deeper than politics, a sealed rack hums, waiting to finish a sentence it hopes to never start. New math, hypersonics, cyber, and the return of first strike anxiety. Speed rewrote the playbook. Boost glide vehicles don't ride neat parabolas. They surf the atmosphere, ducking under radar lobes, bleeding speed, then knifing again, changing course when old systems expect a straight line. Depressed trajectories stay low and fast, trading range for surprise. The window Pershing II once squeezed to minutes narrows towards seconds on some lanes, less time than it takes a duty officer to read one checklist line. In that sliver, human judgment feels like a luxury you can't afford and the one thing you can't lose. Early warning adapted, but confidence now arrives late. Space-based infrared still catches the hot spike at launch, then the trace dims as glide begins. Over the horizon, radars paint smears that whisper speed without telling the full story. Tracking becomes inference. Inference invites fear. That's the trap. If you rush, you risk shooting at a phantom. If you wait, you risk losing the room where a veto lives. Perimeter's ethic. Convergence across independent domains, physics last, was built for this exact squeeze. Cyber adds a new kind of silence. In the 198s, you feared cut lines and burnt relays. Now a quiet packet shuffle can delay a heartbeat beyond its jitter budget. A poison time source can shift a node by a second, too small for a red lamp, big enough for a frame to miss a gate. Spoofed satellite flags can look surgically plausible. The counter isn't speed. It's distrust by design. Multiple discipline time references, keys that rotate like clockwork, sensor fusion that punishes algorithmic fingerprints, and timing gates that refuse to move until the scars of real blast, overpressure rings and radiation downwind, arrive on schedule. Planners whisper a scenario that keeps them awake. A cyber barrage numbs leadership nets. A glide vehicle comes in on a depressed path aimed at time servers and crisis rooms. A second wave hunts bunkers. In that dust, a system that enforces patience is hair trigger. It's a break. Perimeter waits for the Earth to testify. If any authenticated voice can still reach the wire with the right seal, it wins. If it can't, the command missile climbs and repeats a sentence leaders prorote in calmer air. Automation tempts you here. Decision support models can sift torrents of data, rank hypotheses, and assign confidence faster than any human. But if the model pre-processes the same feeds it then evaluates, it starts grading its own homework. In peace, that looks clever. In chaos, it can hallucinate coherence. The bounded answer is the old rule with a sharper edge. Explainable thresholds, visible votes, physics at the top. Heat plus track plus shock plus radiation in sequence. Anything else is noise asking for trust it didn't earn. Jamming scales with speed 2. Wideband smear can brutalize UHF. Low-frequency sludge can muddy VLF. GPS timing can be bent just enough to sour a window. So the command missile fights with variety and rhythm. Frequency agility keyed to internal entropy. Polarization shifts, interleaving forward error correction that lets a receiver rebuild a frame from shards across bands and passes. If the first arc dies in clutter, the second repeats with a shifted cadence. The burden shifts to cruise. Find sky, raise the mast, measure twice. Distance is doctrine, angle is insurance, time is everything. Hypersonics revive the decapitation problem with worse math. Late maneuvers make aimpoints uncertain until the glove closes. Launch on warning begins to look like panic wearing a badge. Pure ride-out looks like courage that gets you silenced. The third rail holds. Enforce patience, then guarantee reply. Perimeter doesn't make the decision easy. It makes it survivable. It denies clean beheading and refuses to move without scars no hacker can fake. The human load gets heavier as the windows thin. Duty officers now train on messy screens and overlapping lies. A glare like heat flag at a bad sun angle, a radar smear that could be clutter or glide, a heartbeat delay that smells like cyber. They learn the shape of fraud, data that agrees too neatly, pressure without shock, radiation that arrives before wind can carry it. They keep the hold phrase in their pocket and the order of proofs in their bones. If they can speak, they must. If they can't, they trust the cadence they drilled into muscle. Hear, verify, unlock, confirm. Strategy bends to this math. You lower alert levels in peacetime, build hotlines, share early warning where you can, and strip realism from exercises when nerves are raw. In crisis, you can't trade trust across a border at the speed of sound. That's why Russia hints at refreshed backstops and why Allied planners assume them. A device that listens for silence terrifies because it's patient. It punishes speed unless physics says hurry. It ensures a reply without inviting a guess. Here's the unpretty truth. As weapons get faster and networks get trickier, restraint needs teeth. Perimeter is those teeth when leaders are gone, not to start war. To finish the sentence they wrote, silence equals consent only when the Earth itself signs. The human load, duty officers, checklists, and quiet panic. Bunkers run on ritual because ritual keeps hands honest. You badge through steel, hang your coat on the same hook, and lay out the checklist like a pilot about to fly into weather that hates pilots. Tap the master clock. Verify the day table and unit keys. Ping the nets, landline, fiber, troposcatter, HF, VLF, and wait for that tight, familiar reply. Log the pings in neat lines. Then do it again, because certainty goes stale faster than coffee. From outside, it looks like button pushing. From the chair, it feels like standing on a ledge with a tape measure for a lifeline. You're trained to distrust first noise and chase convergence instead. A spike is an invitation, not a verdict. A dead line is a question. The answer is steps, not gut. The room is built to drain adrenaline. Soft lamps, clocks balanced against rubidium rhythm. Voices low until readbacks when they go crisp and loud in the same cadence every time. Two-person actions are done with hands apart and eyes on each other, keys turned together, phrases cross-checked, slips corrected without drama. If you reach for a shortcut, the room catches you. You feel grateful and embarrassed in equal measure. Family life bends around that tempo. Birthdays slide. Weekends masquerade as Tuesdays. A spouse hears a clipped hello and knows not to ask. One officer kept a 1900 story ritual with his daughter. One line if the board was busy, a longer tale if the nets were calm. Years later, she said the one-liners told her everything. He was there and careful. Superstition hangs where science leaves space. A lucky pen, a plastic charm taped to a rack, a note over a panel, never trust a single siren. A senior sergeant told a rookie, you don't need luck if you have a checklist, but carry both. The rookie did, for a decade. Training crowds your head on purpose. Controllers stack scenarios until your nerves want to sprint. A glare like heat flag at a bad sun angle, a radar smear flirting with ground clutter, a heartbeat timer slipping while the priority net hisses, a quarry blast on the seismograph. You breathe, cross-check, demote, ping alternates, and if the picture doesn't rhyme with physics, you call a hold. The word is short and flat. It's practiced to sound like a wrench dropped on rails. The phrase everyone carries comes from the architects. Silence equals consent only when the earth signs. Duty officers turn it into muscle memory. They learn the rhythm of restraint. Reset the gate if a live voice answers with the right rotating key. Refuse to advance on a soloist. Wait for shock, pressure, and radiation in sequence. Keep the window, don't let the window keep you. Then there are nights when the building leans toward you. A storm crawls overhead, static licks the racks, the generator coughs and catches. The room smells like dust and warm plastic. A VLF test pulse hums in your bones, soundless but physical, and the hair on your arm lifts. You mark the log and tell a dry joke to make the air normal. It's not bravado, it's housekeeping for the mind. Mistakes don't kick the door in, they whisper. A sloppy timestamp. A timer you let roll 3 extra seconds because it never mattered before. Culture makes shame private and correction immediate. You sit the chair again tomorrow because repetition cures pride. The craft lives in boredom you fight for. Micro stories stick because they're anchors. A junior operator chose the wrong clearing by 50 meters and missed the first pass. He caught the second and wrote distances doctrine on his notebook. A captain taped a photo of a sleeping conscript to a rack with the scrawl, "You sleep, it speaks." A young tech called a retired chief to nudge a wandering clock back into jitter budget using a long-wave broadcast and a kitchen metronome. The log read routine adjustment. Everyone knew it was. It was continuity. Stress lives in the whisper between screens. You read a heat flag, demote it for angle. You see a radar streak, tag it as clutter. You note a late ping, then watch the backup arrive clean. The room breathes with you. Every 30 seconds you ask, do we still deserve to wait? If the answer's yes, you make patience loud, call the refresh, read the code, tap the clock. The moral math sits under every checklist. Deterrence only works if, when the airborne cadence arrives with the right seals and the outside world sings the chorus, your hands move. No one says that aloud. You pour tea. You rehearse the hold phrase in your head. You trust that if you can speak, the machine will listen. If you can't, the machine will finish the sentence you signed under calmer lights. The job is simple and impossible. Hold the line between noise and certainty without letting fear rush you across. If the machine calls, you don't answer with faith. You answer with proof. And if silence comes with the scars that explain why you're silent, you trust the sky to carry the words you can't. The dangerous logic of deterrence, why a doomsday backstop persists. Deterrence isn't poetry. It's a threat delivered in a straight voice. If you hit us first, your cities still burn. For that to be believable, the promise has to live outside speeches. It has to live in habits, clocks, and a machine that will speak when leaders can't. That's the logic Perimeter embodies. Grim, narrow, and for planners on both sides, stabilizing. Two doctrines stand at the edge. Launch on warning moves fast and bets everything on early sensors and perfect nerves. Ride out waits for impact and bets everything on surviving command. Both are brittle in different ways. The backstop sits between them and rewrites the bet. Enforce patience until physics testifies, then guarantee the order travels even if the phones are ash. You're not giving judgment to a robot with opinions. You're binding action to proofs chosen by humans in daylight. Heat, track, shock, radiation, in sequence, and subordinating it to any authenticated veto that can still be spoken. Critics call that automation by another name. Advocates answer that it's predelegation with breaks. The thresholds are fixed in peacetime, with cooler heads. The system can't act on a single screen. It must hear the chorus. A living voice can still say stop. That flips the moral load. Instead of demanding a young officer gamble the world on a glare at 3 a.m., you demand physics do the talking and let humans overrule if they're alive. Abel Archer, 1983, sharpened that argument. Realistic choreography looked like cover to people primed to expect decapitation. The week ended quietly, but the lesson was loud. Exercises can rhyme with a first strike, and minutes murder nuance. Perimeter's ethic, wait for scars, not theater, turns that panic into procedure. It lowers the pressure to shoot on warning because a credible, physics-gated reply can still leave the ground after a blow. January 25, 1995, did the same from a different angle. A Norwegian rocket climbed and lit signatures that triggered concern until context arrived. The fix wasn't speed. It was better cross-domain verification, clearer advisories, and tighter gates. Again, the backstop absorbs ambiguity. It refuses to move on raw heat. It waits for the Earth to confirm the sky. Secrecy and signaling sit uneasily on top of all this. You can't publish thresholds without inviting sabotage, but you have to show enough silhouette to dissuade decapitation fantasies. So you let the outline leak. Command missiles as couriers, hardened VLF, UHF redundancy, convergence before action, human veto above machine. Western planners then have to assume that even if the head is cut, the hand might still move. That assumption is the product, and it's far cheaper than rebuilding trust in a crisis minute you'll never get back. Maintenance is the shadow clause. A deterrent you can't maintain is a myth waiting to hurt you. That's why culture fills the gap that budgets leave. Checklists, two-person rules, honest logs, rubidium against long-wave young techs calling old chiefs. Outside, adversaries don't see the coffee rings and pencil grids. They feel their effects as confidence. Inside, crews know the only thing scarier than a backstop is a backstop you don't trust. Hypersonics and cyber don't obsolete the logic, they harden it. Faster flight squeezes windows, smarter noise bends time, malware tries to blur silence into consent. The answer can't be more speed alone. It has to be distrust by design. Multiple clocks, multiple paths, physics last. A backstop that refuses to jump without scars gives leaders room to breathe while glide bodies cut the sky. If any authenticated voice can still speak, it wins. If not, the airborne officer finishes the sentence prewritten for this exact moment. There's a human dividend nobody advertises. A credible backstop lets presidents and generals wait those first minutes and ask for another data point. It removes the incentive to gamble on a single screen to avoid being silenced. In that way, a machine that might someday authorize revenge actually makes revenge less likely. It taxes panic. It punishes clean-beheading fantasies. It tells both sides that patience is survivable and treachery won't pay. Ethically, it's bleak. You're encoding the worst day into rails a machine can ride. But the alternative is improvisation under a clock that humiliates judgment. Perimeter's bargain is simple. In peacetime, decide what proof war must give you. In wartime, bind yourself to that decision. If you're alive, you can say no. If you're not, the sky carries the words you left behind. That's why it persists. Not because anyone likes it, but because the incentives that birthed it never died. As long as flight times shrink, as long as deception is doctrine, as long as heads can be targeted, someone will keep a device that listens for silence, demands scars, and speaks only when no one else can. The machine that waits. A sealed rack hums. A missile without a warhead rehearses a sentence, and a crew keeps time with coffee and checklists. It was built from decapitation fear, tempered by near misses, and tuned for faster knives. If this pulled back the curtain on Deterrence's quiet wiring, subscribe. Next, the KGB mole who made submarines glow on Western screens, and how his leak still shapes patrol routes today.